I'm Donna Van Buren, and I'm joined by my colleague Sean Larkins. I'm joining you from Perth in Western Australia, and so I'm saying good evening. And Sean is joining you from London, and so he's saying good morning. Look, Sean and I have worked together as colleagues for several years now, and what we want to share with you is both findings and actions coming from the global research with government communicators and policymakers from the WPP Leaders Report, and then how we've looked at applying those findings, advising governments on both people, structure, capability and skills in governments around Australia and also into Europe and the UK. So Sean's going to kick off and I'm going to rejoin you halfway through the presentation.
Thank you, Donna, and apologies that we're a little late. I think there were some gremlins in the line between London and Perth, but we'll go ahead. So those of us who work in government communications, we should be feeling pretty smug around about now. I mean, I know it's been a difficult year. I know things haven't gone brilliantly for very many people, and certainly those of us that are in the Northern Hemisphere, we face a very difficult winter. But we have demonstrated beyond any doubt that when done well, government communication can save lives. I'm going to pause and say that again. We have saved lives, and we should just celebrate that fact. I know it's not been easy, and there are things that we need to improve on and to redevelop in order to face the challenges that lay ahead. But I want to start by going back to those kind of halcyon days before COVID, back to 2017. So in 2017, we published the Leaders Report, and it was the first global study into the state of government communications. And it identified some of the big challenges that our profession faces in terms of performance, in terms of ability, even in terms of legitimacy, you know, the challenge of being taken seriously as a profession within government. And we talked to over 1,000 respondents from about 50 countries, all working within government communications. And there are four key things that jumped out to me that I just want to kind of reflect on here. 85% of respondents said that communication is not regularly involved in policy development, and we'll come back to that a little later. 3/4 said the citizen is not taken into account in decision making, and that terrifies me. If we're not making decisions on behalf of the citizen, who are we making decisions on behalf of? 60%, nearly 2/3, said that communication skews towards one-way flows of information. We're just pushing out information at the public without really stopping to pause, to listen to their response, to engage with citizens. And 54% said that bureaucracy was their number one challenge on getting anything done. And that figure was much higher in Australia. It was around about 75% of people we spoke to in state and at federal level within government said that they were drowning in bureaucracy. So not a great start. And also it leads on to, I think, kind of four key challenges that we're now facing. I mean, four is a lie. Government communicators face many more challenges than these, but I think these are particularly paramount. All of these challenges here existed before the pandemic, and the pandemic has had profound implications on all four. Changes in media consumption, changes in the geopolitical environment in which we all live, the changing relationship between citizen and state, and the changing definition of community, which is something that's been exacerbated by COVID-19. And I want to go through all of these in a little more detail. I mean, the first one, which is around changes in media consumption, you will all know this. You know, over the last 20 years, we've seen a huge shift in consumption of media from desktop to mobile. We all have, you know, at least one of these. If you're unlucky like me, you have more than one. Being just how we live our lives. Secondly, because we're watching things through a smaller screen, we have shifted from text to visual. We've shifted, in effect, from rational communication to emotional communication. And we see that writ large with things like Donald Trump in the United States, Make America Great Again, is an emotional cry. It isn't a policy platform. It's about communicating on emotions. And the third one really is around that shift from search to discovery. We're no longer online with a sense of purpose. It's just how we live our lives. Now, that's a real revolution in communication. And every previous revolution in communication has been followed by a revolution in society. So the printing press led to the Protestant Reformation and the falling power of the monasteries in Europe, for example. Radio led to the rise of fascism and communism, television to the rise of the consumer society. So what are the social media challenges? What revolution is that bringing? Well, we're still assessing some of the consequences of that, but it's fundamentally changed how we connect with others. And it sounds almost asinine because it's social media, it's all about connection. But actually, in some respects, social media has been liberating, but also constricting. We have lost our sense of a shared space. We live in bubbles. Living in bubbles has led to a decline in trust. There's no shared space for democratic debate or a splintering of audiences. Facebook, it's our new town square. It's where we meet. It's where we discuss. It's where we protest. It's where we shame people. And Twitter, in some respects, has just added to our fight or flight mechanism. Twitter doesn't encourage calm reflection. It represents a binary world, almost like a kind of wartime world. So that sense of fight or flight means that what we get to click is driven by, not by consensus, it's driven by division, it's driven by hate, it's driven by fear. So this is a kind of war setting that we mentally find ourselves in. But it's a war unlike any others because it's a war that actively filters out the voice of government rather than reinforcing it. And since COVID, we've seen an increase in the number of people looking for news sources and trusted news online, but still the vast majority of what happens in the social media bubble actively filters out government. And that's hard for us. Secondly, there have been huge geopolitical changes. We have moved from a sense of unity and control in our own countries to a sense of interdependency. We see an increase in geopolitical order and terrorism. We've seen an increase in the number of people leading better lives. We're better educated, better fed, better housed than we ever have been before. But that's led to the growth of individualization, individuality. It's me, it's my family, we're more important than community. And that growth of technology means that we're in a constant state of disruption, and that's leading people to feel more uncertain than at any time since the onset of the Cold War, and COVID-19 has only added to that. You know, there's no new normal in sight. Thirdly, and for anyone that's ever heard me speak before, I bang on about this a lot, so apologies, but we have shifted from that age of deference where we looked up to our village elders, to our mayor, to our imam, our priest, our rabbi, to what we thought was an age of reference. Give people more information, they'll make better and wiser and more informed choices for themselves. And that doesn't happen. What we realized is that we were in a sense of proximity, that actually the relationships that are most important to us now are those with people that we feel we share an emotional connection with. They don't need to be people close to us. Proximity isn't about geographic closeness. It's about those that we feel an emotional closeness with. And actually we've now moved beyond that, I think, because COVID now pushes us from deference to reference to proximity to dependency. You know, we are now more dependent on government than we have at any time in the last 30 years. And citizens are now saying, well, if government can save my job in the times of a crisis, if it can pay my wages in times of a crisis, why can't it do that all the time? So citizens are now more demanding of government. The fourth challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is that changing definition of community. We self-define our own community. We see safety and security. This is something that's come out very much from research since COVID, that many people changed their behaviors, wore a mask, social distance because they wanted to protect their community. But community is kind of self-defined. It's amorphous. We can't necessarily visualize it. At the same time of feeling closer to our community, we felt more distant from our neighbors. Our neighbors, we can visualize them, we see who they are. We see them as competitors for limited healthcare resources. We see them as those people that might be bringing COVID or other diseases into our buildings. So that sense of almost conflicts at home makes us more susceptible to things like fake news and disinformation. And we've seen a massive increase in things like motivated reasoning. You know, we absolutely deliberately filter out opposing views. So an example of motivated reasoning, for example, is imagine you're watching a footy game and someone commits a foul against your star player. You're obviously completely outraged about that. But if it's the other way around, your star player commits a foul on another team member's player, well, that's because it's a tough game. And, footballers need to just kind of man up and get on with it. There's nothing wrong with that. We see that in Brexit. We've seen that in the American election. That motivated reasoning is something that goes to the very heart of how we'll need to communicate with citizens moving forward. So where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us, I think, with four key challenges, and they're all underpinned by the recognition that all government communication should be about behaviour change. All of those changes, that social distancing, the mask wearing, the washing of hands that we've seen over the last 9 months hasn't happened by accident. We've delivered that. But that's easier to do when there is a threat, an immediate threat of danger, which is now passing. We're moving into our secondary stage, a third stage of dealing with COVID. So to change behaviour, we need to build trust. Governments, politicians in particular, not very good at that. We need to understand our audiences better. That's making that permanent shift from demographics to psychographics, communicating and engaging with citizens, not based on who they are, but what they think, what they believe, what they do. And that increased dependence between citizen and state is not going to end anytime soon. We need to manage expectations, and that means thinking long term. It means setting out a long-term plan. It means being honest. It means avoiding hubris. And finally, in an age of volatility, communication needs flexibility and adaptability to preempt, to react and adapt, and we can't do that without being integrated into policy. And COVID has brought into very sharp relief how easy it is to fail when communication is not developed hand in hand with strategy. Now, the work that Donna and I have done over the last 5 years and the research that we did across more than 50 countries has identified 5 key factors that underpin successful government communications. And they are strategy. What's our underlying strategy? What are the tools, the structures, and the processes that we work towards? How do we integrate that into something which is consistent, which is a clear narrative? And then, of course, hugely dependent on our people and the skills that they have. Now, we don't have an awful lot of time today, so we're going to focus on 2, and that's people and structure. More than ever, we need to elevate the status and the modus operandi of the communication function. It needs to be better integrated with and better serve policy. And I'm going to hand over to Donna now, who's going to tell you what we've learned about how that can be done.
Thanks, Sean. So I guess a nice place to start is what of the many choices we have for operating models, what works best? And what we see typically both around governments in Australia and in the Northern Hemisphere is one of 3 operating models. And really this choice of model comes down to a part of the process is choosing to what extent you want to outsource versus insource various communication functions, and how rapid a response you need in terms of some of those functions. And also to what extent can your government move towards a cross-agency model. So the first of the classic models is a centralised model, very much a command and control, where there is a very big and capable hub, usually housed within a department of Premier and Cabinet or a Prime Minister's office. Very good when you're trying to control message, when you want efficiency out of channel and out of media buying. And also very good to keep communications in alignment with ministerial priorities. And very good for controlling, I guess, rogue campaigns that sometimes we see coming out of smaller agencies. But there are some downsides of it. It's great when you're actually wanting to message and communicate through crises, like in times that we are at the moment. But it can create over-dependency, and it can really lead to communications that overlook policy nuance and audience nuance that are really housed within independent, separate departments. So the next model perhaps is one that's more common, particularly in Australia, and that's a hub and spoke model, where some functions are centralised from the centre, but others are kept as a capability set within individual departments. So it might be that above the line media communications and perhaps evaluation and research is housed centrally, but other functions are housed and resourced up within individual departments. One of the problems with this is we find that we see pockets of excellence in terms of capability in some agencies that are not replicated in others. And it also often leads to really high-performing communications professionals who sometimes sit in weaker teams and can feel quite isolated in different agencies and find it hard to get career and promotional opportunities when they're the star performance who's been pigeonholed into a very narrow capability set. The partnership or agency model is one where you contract out more of the communications function. And the downside of this, although it creates cost efficiency, is actually where your communications professionals can often feel like they're purely contract managers. And another alternative is where departments start to set themselves up as being fee-for-service profit centres around communication functions, which sometimes we also see can lead to this growing of a beast where you're selling things all the time internally in order to keep people busy in their communication roles. If we move on, I guess, how do we actually develop a skill set depending on the mode, the operational model that you want to take forward? And look, even a couple of years ago, we would have said that an effective government communications function is structured around these 5 specialisms. And even these 5 specialisms represented a real stretch and challenge for many government agencies who are being forced to move away from the traditional media comms skill set, particularly that's built around journalistic skills, writing skills, media management and managing media outlets, that for all the reasons that Sean's alluded to. We see that digital and design has become a relatively new and essential specialism. And we also place the importance on public engagement in terms of encouraging and two-way dialogues with our citizens. And that means it's building in functions that involve listening as well as telling and speaking to, and of course, internal engagement. What we would say, though, in very recent times is actually we now need to multiply out that discipline set. So we now need to think about more than 5 disciplines, and we're actually fracturing those 5 core specialisms into subspecialisms. So we now see an increasing need for deeper and broader skills across behaviour change, evaluation, data visualisation, data analytics, crisis management, trust, and managing misinformation and disinformation, for example. And so given those specialisms and how tough it's been for governments to orient themselves around it, we would typically see a communication team that's structured a bit like this, and some of you might recognise a structure like that. So 5 very parallel specialism teams, quite deep, with many people sitting sometimes, if you can afford it, within those teams, overseen by an exec branch manager of communications and engagement. And or a slight nuance of that, another popular structure that we're seeing in many government departments in particular, where we recognise the need or the role of the digital and design team to actually support those other specialisms, so it sits underneath them. But nonetheless, what we still see are teams of specialism working in parallel. And what we would call this is a whole lot of what we say as I-shaped people. So people who are very deeply skilled in a narrow set of specialisms. Where we really want to move to is a new way of structuring teams and building capability within government communication functions. And what we really think the future is taking us towards is a set of blended skills with what we call T-shaped people. So T-shaped people have, firstly, a width of knowledge that stretches across these 5 disciplines. So they know a little bit or intuitively understand the role of the 5 disciplines, and they need to know how they contribute to developing good government communications. Their second skill set tier, if you like, is that they are then familiar with a subset of those specialisms. So they actually now have very hands-on acquired expertise in a couple of subset specialisms. And then the third tier where we get to T-shaped people is that they have a very deep, and they are actually expert in what we would say is 2 to 6 very narrowed specialisms. So we get T-shaped people who are very expert in a very specific set of skills, but laid onto that is their understanding of how the other part, the skill sets, coordinate with each other and contribute together.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Donna. We've got 1 to 2 minutes left, so thank you. Just a warning.
So I guess the best in terms of designing teams for the future is thinking about how do we actually build T-shaped people into our departments, and what that looks like in terms of the need to both develop professional development programs that lift government communications into a profession that has a really strong learning and development program behind it, and that builds communication teams that are a collection of the different specialisms fit for the particular policy area or piece of communication that is being developed. And what really this means is driving government departments to think about whole of government and cross communication teams that are built fit for purpose. For example, if you work in the area of early childhood, that's a policy area that will require communications that has touch points into justice, into community corrections, into education, into health, into policing even. So we really need to think about that. Sean, I'm going to hand back to you to do a quick pulling this together, given that we're short for time.
Great, thank you, Donna. So as Donna said, I think it requires a need for continued professional development. Let's be honest, we're not going to be recruiting masses of staff in communication soon. We've demonstrated our worth, but governments face enormous financial challenges. So we need to continue to focus on the professional development of our staff. We need to look at how we roster staff, how we ring-fence staff away from crisis management so we can continue with the longer-term strategic stuff. And also we need to be thinking very carefully about how we recruit in the future. I know from some of the projects that I've worked on, you know, in many areas, the bedrock of recruitment is, well, we need someone with a degree. And actually these days, having someone that can communicate online, that has an online presence, that knows how communities of interest develop, far more important than academic qualifications. One of the best recruits I ever had was a young gay man that was a drag queen by night and had created this entire persona that he lived at the weekend. Much more practical experience than most people coming out of university, knew exactly how to create an online brand and market it. So really thinking in a slightly different way. I think we have just about a minute left. So really the only thing that I would say is look, every government is unique. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. There isn't a kind of box of tricks that shows you the order that you need to make change. But what you do need is to understand the changing context in which communications were taking place before and after COVID, and to think about that challenge of building trust, of understanding your audience much better, and of communicating not just for the short term, but for the long term.